Welcome to another edition of Dan Frequently Asked Questions, in which we address questions that are of interest to divers. In this edition, we are going to dealing with emphysema and diving. Keep watching. Okay, so we got a question about a diver who has the initial stages of emphysema, wants to undertake free diving, not necessarily scuba diving, and wants to know whether it's safe or not. Well, we need to backtrack a little bit and think about emphysema as such. Emphysema, which is often the consequence of smoking, although it can be related to a genetically inherited disease, is something that causes the little sacs in the lung, the alveoli, to actually coalesce. In other words, the boundaries between them break down. And so you eventually have what we call blebs. Now, generally speaking, when we refer to free diving, an individual is able to descend with the amount of lung volume that they had at the surface and return with it, and thereby not necessarily having the risk of a lung overpressure injury. And that's the rationale which I read between the lines of this individual's question. The difficulty is that with emphysema, one can have regions of the lung that actually are not as compliant as others, meaning that some areas of the lungs can stretch and in fact overexpand as they return to their original volume and the person is ascending back to the surface. So theoretically, it is possible to develop arterial gas embolism with emphysema, even though you're free diving, and certainly if you're doing scuba diving. Now, how to get around this would be to do what we call a high-resolution CAT scan of the lungs to see whether there are lung blebs, and to do what we call body plethysmography with a pulmonologist, where they can see whether there's excessive residual volume. This sounds all very fancy, but the principle behind it is to see whether there's air trapping within the lung and whether there's a risk of this overexpanding as the person returns back to the surface. So as we often say in medicine when asked a question, it depends. And we can't simply give a yes or no in a blanket fashion. It needs to be individualized, and this individual may or may not be able to do free diving and or even scuba diving. If the emphysema is in such early stages that the person is fit enough in order to do free diving, the chances are that it's not too bad, but it is important to check whether there are blebs, and particularly blebs in the lower parts or the middle parts of the lung. The upper parts are not that much of a problem because they typically remain hyper, or let's say inflated during the course of a dive, and hence don't necessarily have tremendous circulation, which would then introduce bubbles into the circulation. But the lower parts that get circulation, if they were to overexpand, then bubbles can enter the circulation and cause problems. I hope that answers your question. It's a good question, and you need some further workup. And a good pulmonologist, knowledgeable about diving medicine, would be the best place to start. Hope that helps. Thanks for asking, and until next time, safe diving.